It is one of the few unsolved mass murders in America. A father, his two little girls, another teenage girl, all shot and killed at a Las Cruces bowling alley nearly 33 years ago.
At 8:30 in the morning, the doors were already open. Inside a bowling alley in Las Cruces, the day had already begun. It was quiet, routine, the kind of morning that blends into every other morning. Registers were being counted. Paperwork was being organized. The building was waking up slowly. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt off. Until two men walked in. They didn't force their way inside. They didn't make noise. They entered through an unlocked door. And within minutes, that quiet morning would turn into one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. 7 people would be shot, 5 would die, 3 of them were children, and nearly 3 decades later, no one has ever been arrested, and this is the open file. The bowling alley sat at 1201 East Amador Avenue, a familiar place, the kind of business that people in the area passed every day without thinking twice. Inside, the morning shift had already begun. At the center of it was the manager, Stephanie C. Senak. She was in her office preparing to open. With her were 2 young girls, her 12-year-old daughter, Melissa Ripas, and Melissa's 13-year-old friend, Amy Hauser. They were planning to supervise the bowling alley's daycare that morning. In another part of the building, the cook, Ida Holgin, was working in the kitchen. Everything about the environment suggested normalcy. Adults working, children present, a routine morning beginning like any other. Then the 2 men entered. They came through an unlocked door. No forced entry, no warning, just access. One of them immediately confronted Ida Holgin. He pulled out a .22 caliber pistol. No hesitation, no escalation, just control. He ordered her to move, to walk, to comply. He led her to the office, where the others were already being held. That detail is critical, because it means this wasn't random movement. This wasn't confusion, it was coordinated. 2 suspects, 2 positions, one controlling the kitchen, the other already inside the office, and within minutes, everyone was contained. Inside the office, the victims were forced to the ground, ordered to lie down, restrained, held in place. That changes everything, because restraint takes time, it takes coordination, and it requires control over multiple people at once. This wasn't a situation spiraling out of control. It started controlled, and it stayed that way. At some point during the robbery, the suspects accessed the safe. They took between $4,000 and $5,000. Cash, quick, efficient. On the surface, it looks like a robbery. But then something happened that complicates everything. A man named Steve Terran walked in. He wasn't part of the original scene. He wasn't supposed to be there at that moment. He had brought his 2 daughters with him. 2-year-old Valerie Terran, 6-year-old Paula Holgin. He had been unable to find a babysitter, so he planned to drop them off at the daycare inside the bowling alley. When he entered the building, something was off. No one was visible. No one was moving through the open space. So he walked toward the office and walked directly into the situation. That moment may be one of the most important turning points in the entire case, because now the suspects had a decision to make. Do they maintain control, or do they escalate? What happened next suggests that whatever plan existed, it changed. And this is where the case stops making sense, because everything up to this point could still be explained as a robbery. But what happens next is where that explanation falls apart completely. All 7 victims were shot multiple times at point-blank range. This wasn't panic firing. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate. Each victim was targeted. Each shot controlled. The level of violence exceeded what was necessary for a robbery. And that's where the case fractures, because now the motive becomes unclear. If the goal was money, the money had already been taken. If the goal was control, control had already been established. So why escalate? And if you were standing in that office, watching this unfold, you would know instantly this wasn't just about money. After the shooting, the suspects didn't immediately leave. Instead, they attempted to destroy the scene. They set fire to papers inside the office, an effort to burn the room, to eliminate evidence, to erase what had happened. But the fire didn't fully take. At 8:33 a.m., the fire was reported. That timing matters, because it means everything. The entry, the control, the robbery, the arrival of Steve Terran, the execution, the attempted arson. All of it happened within a tight window. Inside the office, something else happened, something that may have saved lives. Despite being shot 5 times, Melissa Repas survived, and she managed to reach the phone. She called 911. That call brought emergency responders to the scene quickly. It saved her life. It saved her mother's life. It saved Ida Holgan's life. But it couldn't save everyone. Amy Hauser died at the scene. Paula Holgan died at the scene. Steve Terran died at the scene. Valerie Terran was transported to a hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. Stephanie Senak survived initially, but years later, she died from complications related to her injuries. 5 victims, and a scene that would leave investigators with more questions than answers. Law enforcement responded quickly. Within an hour, 10 roadblocks were set up around Las Cruces. Vehicles were stopped. Drivers were questioned. Anyone leaving the city was screened. The response escalated fast. The US Customs Service became involved. Border Patrol joined the search. Aircraft and helicopters were deployed. From the outside, it looked like a case that would break quickly, but it didn't. Because despite the scale of the response, the suspects were gone. No arrests, no immediate suspects, no clear trail, which is where the investigation begins to stall. At first, robbery remained the leading theory, but the deeper investigators looked, the more problems they found. Because robbery doesn't usually involve restraining multiple victims, prolonged control, execution-style shootings, attempted arson. Each of those elements adds weight, and together, they begin to contradict the idea of a simple robbery. So investigators explored another possibility. Was this targeted? Was someone inside that office the intended victim? If so, who? And how did the suspects know they would be there? But again, nothing pointed clearly in that direction. No obvious personal connections surfaced. No clear motive tied to a specific individual. And that leaves the case suspended between explanations. not fully random, not clearly targeted, something in between. Over time, investigators continued working the case. Tips came in, leads were followed, names were examined, but nothing held. Nothing that could move the case forward into an arrest. Years turned into decades, and the investigation evolved. New techniques, new approaches, new attempts to extract evidence from what remained. Authorities began working to develop DNA profiles from evidence collected at the scene, hoping that modern technology could reveal what early investigation could not. But even with those advances, the case remains unsolved. And that brings everything back to the same questions. Why this place? Why that morning? Why those people? Because none of those are random variables. They're decisions. And decisions leave patterns. Even when the people behind them disappear, nearly 30 years later. The building is gone, but the case isn't. The victims are remembered. The timeline is still studied. The questions are still being asked. What happened inside that office wasn't simple. It wasn't chaotic in the way random violence usually is. It was controlled. Because control like this doesn't happen by accident. It points somewhere, to a person, to a decision, to a reason that still hasn't been uncovered. Somewhere. Someone knows exactly what happened. They've known this entire time, and they've never said a word. And until they do, this case doesn't close. The questions are still here. The answers are still out there. And the file stays open.